So as we study the life of Christ, we're looking at different periods of time in which we can divide the ministry of Jesus into its proper event. That's really what we're trying to do with this course, is show you those time periods so that you can understand the flow of the gospel accounts. So let's look at period one in the birth and childhood events that take place in the gospel, and also how the Old Testament prepares the reader for the coming of Jesus. So right from the start, we see two natural births, supernatural births, namely, as you think about the gospel writers, they jump off and begin to discuss the life of Zechariah and Elizabeth, and then you are introduced to Mary and Joseph. So the birth of John the Baptist, again, the focus there is Luke chapter 1, and largely see this during the Advent season, where the pastor will present a study on the life of Christ through Elizabeth and Zechariah. They're godly people, know that they were used by God, and then ultimately that unexpected people are used, young and old. We wouldn't naturally think that an older person would be able to conceive children, but God supernaturally does this by his Spirit. And then, of course, you look at Isaiah chapter 40 and Malachi 3, in the presentation of these two supernatural events are fulfilled prophetically through the coming of Jesus Christ and John the Baptist. So again, you need to go back to Isaiah 40 and Malachi 3 and see how the two prophetic writers are preparing the reader for these two supernatural events. Well, we do know when the angel appears to Zechariah and tells him that John would be born, he is in disbelief, and because of that, there's judgment upon Zechariah. He becomes deaf and mute, unable to talk, and then he is signaling those in attendance about this supernatural event. He uses like a chalkboard to write down what had happened. So when we think about the two supernatural births, we're also looking at Jesus, as I had already mentioned. And of course, Luke, Matthew spend much of their time focused on the virgin birth of Jesus Christ. We note that it's the 6th month when Gabriel appears to the Virgin Mary, and she's probably, as historical writers suggest, potentially 13 to 14 years of age. We don't know, though, so we don't spend a lot of time there, but know that within the Catholic Church, she is noted as being young. And so Protestant tradition has carried that same thought, that here is a young lady whom God's going to use divinely to carry the Messiah. So Joseph could have been roughly around his late 20s or even possibly his 30s. And he was already established in the trade. He was a carpenter. And is the cousin Elizabeth who confirms Jesus' birth. And Mary observed that the birth of John the Baptist when she was present with Elizabeth. And the baby leaps for joy, as Elizabeth describes. Then about a year, you get the marriage of Joseph and Mary. And then by this time, the birth of Jesus comes, and it's probably about 1 year later when the wise men visit Jesus. Now, the early childhood years is somewhat limited in the Gospels. There are apocryphal writings that have been written on Jesus, though we don't take serious those events. And people will often ask, why do we have these apocryphal writings? They're namely there to help us look at the sociological, maybe even some historical information, but typically they are excluded from the Protestant canon is because they're not duly inspired and they lack cohesiveness, and they don't provide unity. But nonetheless, we want to look at what the gospel writers, as we have the 4 gospel writers in our canon, what do they say about the early childhood of Jesus Christ? Know that Jesus' first years are mentioned in Matthew 2. It is Joseph flees to Egypt and with Mary and Jesus. So he's just a baby when Herod announces the edict. And then eventually Joseph receives in a vision to go back, and he returns back to Nazareth, and this then fulfills the prophetic writings that out of Egypt I called my son. Now we have Herod dies, and they're able to feel the freedom to come back to their homeland. Now, Jesus' childhood in Luke chapter 2, Luke mentions as a good physician, talks about how Jesus grew in stature and wisdom with God and with man. And we know that he is lost as they were traveling to the city, and he is amongst the teachers, teaching and instructing, also learning. And Mary and Joseph were just amazed after they find him after a couple days. And so notice some things we can learn from chapter 2, especially chapter 2, verse 40 through 52, that Jesus experienced normal birth and normal growth. When I say normal birth is that Mary carried Jesus to full term, and she gave birth, and Jesus grew from a baby to adulthood. And so he experienced normal growth. He grew mentally as the God-man. Note that he is unfallen in his mind, 100% capacity in the use of his mind. But then he also laid aside the choice to think in that full capacity. And times when the disciples are asking him about the coming of the kingdom, he said that is for the Father to know, and that would be given to the Son later. But Jesus grew spiritually in God, meaning he grew into his relationship with his Father. So at a young age, he already knew who he was, but he's growing in that knowledge. And so there is some application there for us as we think about our growth, our growing mentally in our capacity of theological thoughts about God, and of course our relationship with the Lord. We're growing deeper in our walk with the Lord each day.